Subcommittee on Coast Guard and Maritime Transportation come to order. I ask unanimous consent that the chairman be authorized to declare a recess at any time during today's hearing without objection, so that ordered. I ask unanimous consent that the members who are not on the subcommittee be permitted to be on it and ask questions in the subcommittee today. Without objection, show that ordered. As a reminder, if members wish to insert a document in the record, please also email it to documents@mail.house.gov. Now I recognize myself for the purpose of opening statement for 5 minutes. So we meet today to examine the national security missions of the Coast Guard, focusing on the service's vital efforts in Indo-Pacific and Arctic regions. I'd like to welcome our distinguished witness joining us today, Vice Admiral Peter Gautier. Is that correct?
That's correct, sir.
Thank you. The Deputy Commander of Operations at the U.S. Coast Guard. In 1787, Alexander Hamilton wrote that a few armed vessels judiciously stationed at the entrances of our ports might, at a small expense, be made useful sentinels of the laws. Over the last 200 plus years, the Coast Guard has gone from origins to become a vital sentinel of our national security. Nowhere is this more evident than the Indo-Pacific and the Arctic regions, where the Coast Guard mix of military, regulatory, law enforcement abilities provide the United States with a flexible tool that is essential to advancing national interests. The Indo-Pacific region, which spans from the Pacific coastline to the Indian Ocean, is home to more than half of the world's population, nearly 2/3 of the world's economy, and 7 of the world's largest militaries. As a strategic value to Indo-Pacific continues to grow against the backdrop of increased China territorial activity, the Coast Guard's robust law enforcement presence in the region is needed to ensure U.S. security and prosperity. The Coast Guard leverages a fleet of 5 fast response cutters in Guam, a rotating presence of national security cutters, 12 bilateral law enforcement agreements, and over 60 multilateral agreements to enforce international legal order. But this order is being challenged by China through the state subsidized illegal, unregulated, and unreported fishing, unauthorized incursions of and harassment of foreign vessels. China intentionally acts below the threshold of armed conflict, limiting traditional U.S. Navy response. But there are white holes. Coast Guard cutters act as the modern version of Roosevelt's Great White Fleet. They leveraged a unique blend of authorities to counter Chinese militant and gray zone activities in a non-escalatory manner unavailable to the U.S. Navy. Furthermore, since the most Indo-Pacific nations have maritime forces resembling the Coast Guard, the service is well positioned to provide operational training and advice and forge partnerships with key regional allies. In the Arctic, the United States similarly has substantial territory and economic interest, including 1 million square miles of territory, a $3 billion seafood industry, and trillions of dollars of mineral and oil reserves. As Russia and China challenge these interests, Coast Guard efforts to project U.S. sovereignty, improve navigation, improve search and rescue capabilities, enforce fishery regulations, and ensure vessel safety are the cornerstone of the U.S. security and prosperity in the region. With its distinctive red hull and Coast Guard racing stripe, icebreakers are a beacon of U.S. power in the far north. Yet despite the strategic importance of the Arctic, the Coast Guard only has 2 icebreakers, Only one of these, Healy, deploys annually to the Arctic to engage in everything from National Science Foundation research to capacity building. Conversely, Russia has a fleet of 55 icebreakers, and China, which has deemed itself a near Arctic state, has a fleet of 4 icebreakers. Russia and China have declared the Arctic region national priorities and have made corresponding investments in the capability and capacity needed to expand their influence. The United States and the Coast Guard are racing to play catch up. I fear we're losing. While the Coast Guard has been working for years to replace and expand its fleet of heavy icebreakers with at least 3 polar security cutters, PSCs, this committee has serious concerns about the Coast Guard's ability to execute this acquisition program and deliver the ships on time. We expect updates as program milestones are met, but no less frequently than every 60 days. To help plug the gap of the near term, this committee supports the Coast Guard's efforts to acquire a commercially available icebreaker, and we hope the service can apply some of the lessons learned from the PSC program as it seeks to expand its medium icebreaker fleet. So we explore the service's national security missions today, focusing on Indo-Pacific and the Arctic. I look forward to learning what the Coast Guard will do to strengthen its capabilities in these critical regions and how Congress can assist. I'd like to thank our witness for joining us here today and look forward to a great discussion. Now I recognize, the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Larson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. First, I want to start by taking a moment to acknowledge the courage of the 5 women today who testified this morning before the Senate's Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations about their experiences with sexual assault and sexual harassment at the Coast Guard Academy. It's incumbent on the Coast Guard and Congress to do everything that we can to ensure cadets are not exposed to sexual assault or harassment at the Academy. Just yesterday, my staff reviewed a prosecution memo that shed light on a lack of accountability at the Coast Guard. And while we continue to conduct oversight and listen to survivors, I'm prepared to do whatever is necessary to ensure a safer experience for every Coastie. Many people are aware of the Coast Guard's search and rescue mission, but I'm glad we're having today's hearing to examine the Coast Guard's lesser-known missions, including efforts to support national security interests in the Indo-Pacific and Arctic regions. Extreme weather events are affecting every aspect of Coast Guard operations, from severe storms causing maritime casualties to coastal erosion at Coast Guard stations. The service is forced to confront climate change on a daily basis, and no place is changing more than the thawing Arctic. The Arctic is experiencing increased cargo and passenger vessel traffic, increased vessel traffic from foreign governments, including Russia and China, and a growing interest in natural resources, including minerals, oil, gas, and fish. The Coast Guard is the lead agency tasked with maritime safety, law enforcement, and national security in the Arctic, but with current resources, it cannot meet the demand. The Coast Guard operates 1 heavy and 1 medium icebreaker that are responsible for maintaining a regular presence in the Arctic and the Antarctic. The combined age of these 2 icebreakers is 72 years. Given the services need to be present in both the Arctic and Antarctic annually, more resources are required. While the Coast Guard is under contract to build more heavy icebreakers, I have serious concerns about the procurement and look forward to hearing how the service plans to ensure the smooth construction and delivery of those cutters. As well, during times of war, the Coast Guard can be transferred in whole or in part to the Navy. Though this has not happened since World War I, the Coast Guard has experienced significant growth in its international missions in support of the Department of Defense. The Coast Guard's operations in the Indo-Pacific illustrate this point. 3 fast response cutters are currently deployed to Guam in support of Indo-Pacific operations, and the service regularly deploys national security cutters to patrol the region. The Coast Guard's presence in the Indo-Pacific is invaluable. As a non-DoD service, the Coast Guard can operate in unique ways and places. For instance, in June of this year, a Coast Guard cutter transited the Taiwan Strait in conjunction with trilateral exercises with the Philippines and Japan. an operation that garners far less attention than if conducted by the U.S. Navy. The Coast Guard's presence in the Arctic and the Indo-Pacific are just two examples of a broader trend of increased demand on the service. Unfortunately, this growth has not come with an increase in the requisite resources, and we're seeing mission strain across the Coast Guard. Just last month, we were alerted that the Coast Guard has a service member shortage of 10%, and as a result, is suspending or scaling back operations at dozens of stations across the country. Coast Guard shoreside infrastructure faces a maintenance backlog of at least $3 billion, and several cutter procurement programs face delays, including the polar security cutters, offshore patrol cutters, and waterways commerce cutters. There are real consequences associated with insufficient funding. While its motto is Semper Paratus, or always ready, I fear we are quickly reaching a point where the Coast Guard will be only sometimes ready. It is time for Congress to fully resource the Coast Guard for all of its missions. I want to thank you, Chair Webster, for holding today's hearing. I look forward to hearing how Congress can do better to support the Coast Guard. With that, I yield back.
I now recognize Ranking Member Carbajal for an opening statement of 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Webster, for another opportunity to dive deeper into the Coast Guard missions. Before we get started, I too want to begin by acknowledging the bravery of the survivors who came forward to testify in the Senate about a culture of sexual assault, sexual harassment, cover-up abuse, and retaliation in the Coast Guard this morning. I hope our witnesses and every leader in the Coast Guard, was watching. Your stories were deeply impactful, and I am committed to doing everything I can to ensure it doesn't happen to another person. The U.S. Coast Guard is vital to national security, but their role in protecting this nation is oftentimes forgotten. With Coast Guard presence on all 7 continents, their missions extend far beyond our shores. Coast Guard operations in areas like the Arctic and the Indo-Pacific directly supports U.S. foreign policy and national security objectives in these regions. Their unique capabilities, mission sets, and longstanding partnerships allow the Coast Guard to be valuable in enhancing maritime governance, safety, and security throughout the world. Cutters and crews regularly engage in professional exchanges and capacity building with partner nations to support a free and open Indo-Pacific. This comes at a time when tensions are high in areas like the South China Sea, where maritime encounters between China and allied nations have increased. A white-hulled cutter poses a less significant threat compared to a gray-hulled Navy vessel, giving the Coast Guard the ability to conduct international diplomacy. As our climate continues to change, the Arctic is melting at an alarming rate, opening up shipping lanes and leading to an increase in commercial traffic in areas once inaccessible. The Coast Guard is tasked with maintaining maritime safety, search and rescue, emergency response, and law enforcement across this vast landscape, but is continually providing insufficient resources. Icebreaking capabilities and presence in the Arctic and Antarctic are limited due to the dismal fleet of 2 operational Coast Guard icebreakers. Increased shipping in the Arctic will increase the need for a Coast Guard presence. The Coast Guard's budget is less than 2% of the Department of Defense's budget comparatively. Yet, along with significant mission growth elsewhere, the Coast Guard is continually expected to increase its assistance to DoD. I'm increasingly concerned that the Coast Guard is not receiving the appropriate resources to effectively conduct their missions. I'm also concerned that the reimbursement that the Coast Guard receives from DoD has not kept up pace with actual costs. As mentioned last hearing, the Coast Guard is facing one of the worst staffing shortages in their history. With a shortage of more than 4,000 personnel, the service will soon begin closing stations and laying up cutters. This poses a serious threat to fulfilling their missions and ensuring national security. Without greater resources and improved recruitment, the Coast Guard will not be able to maintain their international presence and support DoD. While I understand we will not be able to resolve that today, I expect this hearing to help provide a pathway forward and demonstrate the needs of this service. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you very much. I'd like to welcome our witness, thank him for being here today. I'd like to also take a moment to explain our lighting system, which is green means go, yellow means slow up, and red means stop. It's time to end. And so because, and also I'd like to ask unanimous consent that the witness full statement be included in the record. Without objection, show that ordered. Ask unanimous consent that the record of today's hearing remain open until such time as our witness has provided answers to any questions that might be submitted by the members. I also ask unanimous consent that the record remain open for 15 days for any additional comments or information submitted by members or the witness to be included in the records today's hearing. Without objection, show that ordered. As our written testimony has been made a part of the record, the subcommittee asks that you limit your remarks to 5 minutes. And with that, Vice Admiral Gautier, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Webster, Ranking Member Carvajal, Ranking Member Larson, distinguished members of this subcommittee. Thank you for inviting me here today to discuss the U.S. Coast Guard's role in advancing our national security interests across the globe. And a particular thanks for this subcommittee's enduring support of the Coast Guard men and women and their families. Our national security strategy tells us that we're in a decisive decade that will determine the direction of the world and impact security and prosperity of the American people for generations to come. As the U.S. and people around the world struggle to cope with the effects of shared challenges, transnational crime, climate change, and great power competition, more and more our nation and international partners look to us, the U.S. Coast Guard, for maritime governance solutions for those challenges. The Coast Guard has an important role in national security, delivering services across all statutory missions wherever we operate. This is increasingly evident in both the Indo-Pacific and the Arctic. In the Indo-Pacific, we provide Coast Guard services to Americans in Hawaii, Guam, the Commonwealth of the Northern Marianas Islands, and American Samoa, as well as supporting the Compact States of Free Association. The 2022 Indo-Pacific Strategy charges the Coast Guard to increase presence and meaningful engagements with partners, and for good reason. Their top maritime concerns are also ours, and they look to us to help advance their maritime sovereignty and security. Together, we advance regional maritime governance and promote free, prosperous, and secure maritime domains, all squarely in the U.S. interest when these foundational principles are being undermined. The service is relocating the Harriet Lane, a medium-endurance cutter, to Hawaii to increase Coast Guard presence in the region and engagements with partner nations. We've homeported 6 new fast response cutters in Guam and Honolulu. With congressional support in 2024, we would hope to add 4 additional FRCs. These cutters have proven to be an ideal platform with expeditionary capability into and even into the far reaches of Oceania. These capabilities, combined with a long list of Coast Guard activities and partnerships across the Indo-Pacific, to provide unity and strength in bolstering our U.S. maritime governance goals. In the Arctic, we provide Coast Guard services throughout Alaska and the U.S. Arctic region. Like the Indo-Pacific, the Arctic is undergoing physical, operational, and geostrategic transformation. This opens the Arctic region to greater human activity, and with it, increased risk across the maritime sector. The Coast Guard is deeply concerned about rising risk to national security, in particular from Russia and China, as nations compete for diplomatic, economic, and strategic advantage in the Arctic. These changing conditions drive increased demands for Coast Guard services. This year, in Operation Arctic Shield, we increased seasonal presence in the U.S. Arctic by deploying cutters, aircraft, and shore forces to respond to search and rescue cases, inspect bulk oil facilities, complete commercial fishing vessel exams, and conduct oil spill and mass rescue exercises, training, and outreach events across 91 Alaska communities. We need continued support from Congress to build the next generation of Coast Guard capabilities for the Arctic. Funding to increase near-term presence through the acquisition of a commercially available medium icebreaker is included in fiscal year 2024 President's budget request, and we are working with the Navy and Bollinger, Mississippi shipbuilding to advance the Polar Security Cutter acquisition. Never has the Coast Guard leadership been more important in the Arctic, Indo-Pacific, and regions around the globe. With our meaningful combination of authorities, impactful capabilities, and history of performance and partnerships, we play a vital role in national security as we seek to build and sustain a coalition of unified partners to shape each region's maritime domain as peaceful, stable, and cooperative. Mr. Chairman, before I close, might I just thank the two ranking members for mentioning the Senate committee this morning examining sexual assault in the United States Coast Guard. The Commandant of the Coast Guard has this as her #1 priority to get after, and the senior leadership team is totally committed to getting after, embracing, providing the transparency, having the difficult exchanges in order to really attack this challenge. I understand that there were a number of Coast Guard witnesses this morning, both retired and past, and then also on active duty, and I too commend the courage of those individuals in telling some really, really difficult stories. So thank you.
Thank you for your testimony. We will now turn to questions from the panel. I recognize myself for 5 minutes for questions. Vice Admiral, the current Coast Guard acquisition and modernization strategy was devised in the 1990s. While the Coast Guard works to build the cutters and aircraft planned almost 3 decades ago, the world and the service missions have changed. Coast Guard did not plan on operations in the Indo-Pacific and the national security missions it is now assigned. How will the Coast Guard ensure its cutters are equipped to execute its national security missions and that they were not outdated before they even get started operating?
Mr. Chairman, as you mentioned, we're about halfway through a historic recapitalization of Coast Guard assets, our cutters and our aircraft, our C5I systems, about halfway through that. We continually update our evaluations given current trends on what we think our fleet mixes might need to be in the future and what our capabilities are. In fact, to your point, the first national security cutter is now about 15 years old. The last one that is being built today has a number of major systems that are indeed different than the original one. But in terms of how we update things, I'll give you an example. The fleet mix analysis we did for polar security cutters and icebreakers tells us that we think we now need 8 to 9 in a mix of heavy and medium icebreakers in order to tackle the challenges of the Arctic and Antarctic.
With the Coast Guard's new focus on Indo-Pacific, how will the service ensure that it's completely and thoughtfully part of its core missions? How do they do that?
Chairman, thanks to the support of Congress, successive administrations, and partners, the Coast Guard's been getting a lot of support for our growth in the Indo-Pacific. We did things last year like we've moved a Coast Guard cutter from the East Coast, the Harriet Lane, which has now arrived in Hawaii and is going to be part and parcel of our engagement strategies there. As you've mentioned, we've home ported 6 FRCs in between Guam and Honolulu. We've built centers, we've put more people and more teams in the Indo-Pacific. And with your support in the 2024 budget, we want to and need to do more. We have $40 million in a request in order to build and field 4 fast response cutters to continue the good work that we've done in the Indo-Pacific, in addition to some of the logistical capability that we need, aircraft support and maintenance in order to continue our growth to provide the meaningful services that we do.
So given the increased timeline for PSC's delivery, what's the plan in the meantime to allow service to carry out its missions in the Arctic?
Sir, we're pressing forward as quickly as we can and meaningfully with the Polar Security Cutter acquisition. In the meantime, we have requested $150 million in the fiscal year '24 budget to purchase a commercially available icebreaker, which will help us get more presence more quickly up into the Arctic, both in the near term and in the long term, in order to tackle some of the things that we need to do. We have also been in the midst of a very successful surface life extension program to the Coast Guard cutter Polar Star, which is in Sydney right now to be on its way to break out ice in Antarctica to keep that cutter running longer. It's had 3 of the 5 segments of that SLEP, and that's working very well.
We've talked about it. Is there, I know there's very few people even build the ships, much less fix them up. So is there a way to kind of grab out all the middle of it, of the old ship, and put in new, and have a kind of a new ship out of an old hull? Is that possible?
Well, we've examined that, Chairman. The Coast Guard cutter Polar Sea is a sister ship to the Polar Star and hasn't been operational for a number of years now. In an effort to see what we could field more quickly, we did a study back in 2017 that told us it was going to be about $500 million in order to gut and renew that ship and get it back into service. Since then, unfortunately, we use that ship for spare parts. We have removed many more components and systems on that ship in order to keep the Polar Star afloat. So we think the cost of that would be substantially greater, and it would take quite a bit of time in order to do that. So we have not been pursuing that actively.
Has the Coast Guard considered contracting out Antarctica ice breaking to free up the Polar Sea to patrol the Arctic?
We've explored that, Chairman, and there too, there aren't a lot of great options. First of all, we think there's a really important role for a Coast Guard icebreaker in Antarctica, not just to break ice to service the National Science Foundation's McMurdo Station, but to also provide the kind of U.S. sovereignty against the Antarctic Treaty that we believe only a Coast Guard cutter or a U.S. naval vessel can provide. Other than that, there really aren't that many heavy icebreakers in the commercial sector that could be contracted by the National Science Foundation to do that mission,
Well,
at least that we're aware of.
The time has expired. Thank you for your answers. Really appreciate it. Mr. Carbajal or Mr. Larson?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. To start on the Polar Security Cutter, how does the anticipated delay of the PSCs impact the 2022 strategy in the Arctic? Are we going to have to delay the strategy?
Well, we're going off the national strategy for the Arctic region, which presses us to provide that capability, not with like a date certain, but it does encumber delays that, frankly, we don't like as much as anybody. The current contract requires a build at 2025. We're sure that is not going to be the delivery date here. But we do believe that this current shipbuilder is going to be able to start construction in calendar year 2024. And in our current estimate of the time necessary to build, we think they will be able to produce an icebreaker heavy by the end of 2028 or 2029.
Can you confidently have any sea presence above a certain latitude on the water? And what is that latitude as it stands today?
In the absence of a heavy icebreaker, we do have the medium icebreaker Coast Guard cutter Healy, which does patrol every summer in the Arctic, and in fact, every other year has been making a trip to the North Pole. And in this last trip, is just about to complete a round-the-world trip that had it going over the northern coast of Russia right off their exclusive economic zone. So the Healy is a very capable ship. We do need to do a service life extension on Healy. It was built in 1999, and we do need congressional support to do that. We can get national security cutters north of the Bering into the Chukchi Sea seasonally during the summer season, and we do that as much as we can.
And then while that's delayed, is that impacting the plans for the home porting at base Seattle, or are there other issues involved with the delay there?
We're continuing to pursue that aggressively, Congressman. And here's another area where we do need some pretty substantial congressional support. We're working on the first half of the first phase in terms of the dredging of the current Coast Guard base, the Coast Guard slip. And we have sufficient money to complete about half of that first phase. But we've asked in the 2024 budget for $130 million in order to complete that first phase so that we can at least get started on the home porting project for 4 icebreakers there.
With regard, shifting to the Indo-Pacific, are there countries that we want to have relationships with, Coast Guard to Coast Guard, or Coast Guard to maritime law enforcement relationships that we don't have?
For almost every country, sir, there is a constant request and desire to tighten and strengthen the relationship with the United States Coast Guard. There are some obvious countries where we do not and probably do not desire to have relationships there. We are pursuing a couple of countries, though, with longstanding conversations, places like the Solomon Islands and other places that have not yet sort of fully embraced the relationship with the United States. We're continuing to pursue that.
So their presence in their water is, the way I look at it, presence equals sovereignty. So if we can't be in our part of the Arctic and defend that and plant our flag metaphorically there, then it's like we don't own it at all. And so for these countries as well, is the Coast Guard the best service? Why is the Coast Guard the better service to reach out to these countries in order to show them how best to defend their sovereign water?
In terms of the Indo-Pacific states?
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah. Because we're in a strategic competition with competitors that are seeking to turn countries away from the West and undermine the international order. So as part of the grand strategy in the United States as penned in the Indo-Pacific strategy, it's incumbent upon us, and especially the Coast Guard with our special set of capabilities and authorities that our partner nations want and want help from and want to partner with, we then can provide the kind of governance that they seek to counter sort of the corrosive and erosive effects of the competitors in the region.
Just in the last 15 seconds, I'll just thank you for your comments at the end of your testimony. Appreciate hearing that. A few other committees over here are starting to look at the issue of sexual assault, sexual harassment. But that said, we will, on this committee, continue to lead on the oversight on that. And I look forward to hearing more from the Coast Guard and the Coast Guard responding to our requests on those issues.
Welcome that, sir.
Yield back.
Sir, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Vice Admiral, thank you for being here. It's good to meet you at headquarters the other night. Enjoyed it, seeing some of your other folks there as well. The entire country is feeling the pain of historic inflation right now that we're dealing with. And I imagine that inflation is having a pretty good impact on the Coast Guard's infrastructure projects, maintenance, service, and air assets, et cetera. And I wonder and really worry about some of the newer, more junior enlisted coasties that are trying to pay rent in places that were already expensive a few years ago that have now been hit by out-of-control inflation for the last 2.5 years. I'd like to hear from you briefly how inflation is impacting the Coast Guard's national security mission.
Thanks for that question very much,
Yes,
Congressman. I think just like ordinary Americans, our frontline sentinels have suffered in the past from just higher costs of living in general, and then in particular where Coast Guard men and women live on the coast in many areas that tend to be sort of vacation areas and things like that. Housing is a particular challenge, and then getting medical services as well. So enduring congressional support in terms of base pay and our base allowance for housing, medical support, and things like that, we'd be grateful for.
Great, thank you. I'm also interested in discussing some of Coast Guard's unmanned assets. I understand that MQ-9s are being utilized to some capacity in the Caribbean and the Eastern Pacific for counter-drug missions. What unmanned technologies are being used in the Indo-Pacific, and how does the Coast Guard plan to employ them within the Arctic region?
Large unmanned systems like the MQ-9 are very, very capable, and recognize that early on. The Coast Guard and Customs and Border Protection created a joint program office in order to jointly operate MQ-9s. We have not operated any in the Pacific yet. We're operating, CBP operates predominantly, obviously, on the border and is doing more so in Puerto Rico. We're learning lessons from that. In the meantime, we've had long-standing medium-range unmanned aircraft operating off of our national security cutters in the Pacific, predominantly on counter-drug and illegal fishing patrols. Terrific capability as well. We are going to be fielding more into the Pacific, I think, as we learn more about how these particular capabilities fit in the inventory.
Okay, thank you. And how do small drones factor into the Coast Guard's operations and national security mission? And does the Coast Guard plan to expand its fleet of secure drones, and if so, how?
We field quite a bit of small drones across the Coast Guard, sir. What we do is we basically authorize local units to go out and purchase sort of the secure American-built drones, and they can use them for whatever. That could be in inspecting a building, that could be looking at aids to navigation and things like that. Those are pretty ubiquitous in the Coast Guard inventory. The other thing we do that is less known is we have a counter UAS capability in the Coast Guard in order to protect sort of maritime secure facilities, major events, and things like that. That authorization is expiring on February 2nd in the PETA Act, and we would ask Congress to renew that. It's a DHS authority, so on behalf of DHS, we would ask for that to be renewed.
Absolutely, thank you. Last question. In July 2022, the National Marine Fisheries Service released a proposed rule titled Amendments to the North Atlantic Right Whale Vessel Strike Reduction Rule, which would expand the geographic range and number of vessels that would be subject to a 10-knot speed restriction along virtually the entire Atlantic coast for half of the year. This would apply to tens of thousands of vessels not currently subject to speed restrictions. From what I understand, the rule was developed without meaningful consultation with the Coast Guard, and even though the brunt of the enforcement burden would fall on the Coast Guard, the draft rule states we anticipate receiving continued assistance from enforcement partners such as U.S. Coast Guard and state law enforcement agencies. So how would the additional burden of being responsible for essentially writing speeding tickets all along the Atlantic coast negatively impact the Coast Guard's ability to carry out its critical national security mission, if you don't mind?
Not all. So NOAA, we have a long-standing productive relationship with NOAA and National Marine Fisheries. They asked for a consultation for us on this particular draft of the Notice of Proposed Rulemaking. We provided them specific information that they look for in terms of like AIS coverage, in terms of the relationship between a vessel pilot and a vessel master, some very specific stuff as they've crafted the Notice of Proposed Rulemaking. So with regards to enforcement, so that our relationship is strong, but with regards to enforcement, our understanding is some of these areas are pretty expansive. Not all of the vessels that may apply for the speed restriction have AIS, so admittedly, there are going to be challenges to enforcement of that, and the Coast Guard may need some resources if it doesn't fall on us to enforce it.
Yes, sir. Thank you very much. My time has expired, so I yield back. Thank you.
Mr. Carbajal, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Admiral Gautier, the Coast Guard is facing a $3 billion infrastructure backlog and 4,000 personnel shortage. How will the backlog and the shortage impact operations in the Arctic and the Indo-Pacific?
Well, first off, Congressman, as the Commandant has said, to address some of these shortfalls you've described, the Coast Guard needs to grow into a $20 billion organization, and we need to do that within a 10-year time frame. The 3% increases that we're getting budget year by budget year just keep us level with inflation. We need to boost that with Congress's help to 5%. With regards to the Arctic, it has impacted the time and schedule for building things like the polar security cutters because those have been subject to inflation since the original inception and requirements were established. So inflation does cut into it, but we remain committed with Congress's help to do things like purchase a commercially available icebreaker and home port that, to create a world-class home port in Seattle, to build 3 polar security cutters and then move out into medium endurance cutters. It all is incumbent about how much support we get from Congress.
Thank you. Admiral Gautier, I've had the opportunity to see firsthand how the Coast Guard leverages its unique international role. In Panama, the Coast Guard lends capacity as well as technical expertise on illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing, maritime safety, including in the Panama Canal, drug and migrant interdiction, and more. What is the Coast Guard doing in the Indo-Pacific, and how important is its presence?
The easiest way maybe to describe it, and thanks very much for making that trip to Panama, the Commandant, is along 3 lines of effort in the Indo-Pacific. First is persistent presence with things like cutters and aircraft and people, teams, and things like that. The second is advancing meaningful engagements to create and build the partnerships that are so important to us. That, again, is we do capacity building, we do training, we do foreign military sales of our retired cutters. And then lastly, it's all to advance maritime governance. We work through the International Maritime Organization to establish and strengthen the sort of guiding principles and authorities that we hold to in the international community. And everything that we do to do things like help enforcing IUUF in other countries' exclusive economic zones helps us get after the maritime governance piece.
The Coast Guard force commitments to DoD, Indo-Pacific Command, has increased in recent years. Does the Coast Guard anticipate this trend of increased engagement in the region continuing?
We've been pushing forth, Ranking Member, to try to grow our capabilities within our budget in the Indo-Pacific while we maintain our frontline services to the American people in the United States, in our OCONUS states and territories. But we have had some trade space to do more things like national security cutter patrols, things like China Strait transits into the Indian Ocean on occasion, doing things like getting our fast response cutters to the far reaches of places like Palau and Papua New Guinea with ship riders to help them enforce their own places in exclusive economic zones. But we have to take a balanced approach to make sure that we mind and have the priority of providing domestic services first and foremost.
And can you do that without more resources?
We need more resources, Congressman. $20 billion Coast Guard in 10 years. We ask for your support on the 2024 budget request. President's budget request has a lot. It has over $500 million of support to the Coast Guard in the Indo-Pacific in the 2024 budget. There's a lot there that will help us advance our national security interests there.
Thank you very much. Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Mrs. Gonzalez-Colon, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good morning to a witness. We all hear our names here.
We're down at the far end, it's okay.
I just want to say thank you for being here. My first question for you will be, the Chinese illegal, unreported fishing activities in the Indo-Pacific region are also directly targeting the United States and our waters. And early this year, the House Natural Resources Committee, we received testimony on how Chinese illegal, unreported fishing activities have depleted tuna stocks within American Samoa exclusive zones, disrupting the local economy and forcing a tuna cannery, one of their largest employers, not to say the only one, to temporarily suspend operations. I understand that during the Trump administration, efforts were being pursued to study the feasibility of basing Coast Guard cutters in American Samoa to help counter these threats and strengthen our presence in the Southern Pacific region. Can you provide us an update on this and understanding the service I do understand the service has limited resources and that we're facing a workforce shortage as well. And if there's any discussion or evaluations of home porting fast response cutters in American Samoa, if any.
Congresswoman, you gave a great example of just many, many that Chinese IUUF does around the world. In terms of American Samoa, and in specifically, and the Pacific in general, American Samoa is absolutely critical to the United States. Americans live there. It has a large exclusive economic zone. We do actively, first of all, we do have Coast Guard members who are stationed and assigned in American Samoa, predominantly to do marine safety and security and waterways management functions. In terms of patrol and law enforcement, we do patrol the American Samoa exclusive economic zone with things like the fast response cutters. They do come from Guam, and Guam is at some distance. But what we're able to do in Guam is we can cluster resources so we can reap cost savings and benefits there while we still are able to patrol in and around American Samoa without having to have one stationed there. We can provide that as a forward operating location, keep a cutter there for some period of time to do enforcement activities.
And how often do we send our assets to American Samoa?
It's an occasional presence, and I can get you the specific information. With more fast response cutters, we could be there more often.
Question, I know that the U.S. Navy has long focused on expanding its capability and capacity in the Indo-Pacific region, even coining the term pivot to the Pacific. And given that the U.S. Navy is larger and better funded than the Coast Guard, why should the Coast Guard use your limited resources in this region? And I'm not saying it's not worth it. I'm saying what capabilities does the Coast Guard provide to the U.S. that the U.S. Navy is not providing in the region?
I want to make sure I understand. What is the Coast Guard? I'm sorry?
What capabilities does the Coast Guard provide that the U.S. Navy doesn't in the Indo-Pacific region? And what is the Coast Guard focus in the Indo-Pacific, having the U.S. Navy fleet in the area?
Understand. Thank you. So really, we do provide complementary capabilities, but the U.S. Coast Guard is different. While the Navy focuses on combat readiness and integrated deterrence to prevent bad behaviors, we're different in that we have different capabilities as a military organization, law enforcement, humanitarian service, and a regulator to provide the sorts of relationship-building opportunities with partner nations that they look to from us while the Navy continues integrated deterrence. We provide positive benefits as Navy prevents bad behaviors, I think is maybe the simplest way I can say it.
Question, I know I'm running out of time, but the Healy is currently sailing home from its annual deployment to the Arctic. And we understand that on this patrol, movements were closely monitored by Russia. Has the Coast Guard witnesses any changes in Russia's activities or posturing in the wake of the Russian-Ukraine war in the Arctic?
I'm sorry, my hearing isn't all that great. Could you repeat
Has
that?
the Coast Guard witnessed any change in Russia's activity or posturing in the wake of the Russia-Ukraine war while the Healy is transiting to the Northern Sea route?
It really has changed the relationship in very bad ways. We have and do maintain a functional relationship between the United States Coast Guard and Russia Border Guard because we have to. We're neighbors, and we need practical communications in order to do things like search and rescue and fisheries enforcement. However, we don't do any planning, any exercising with the Russians. We are now seeing, because of this conflict, more Russian cargo, and because of climate change, more Russian cargo coming through the Northern Sea route that come down in through the Bering Strait, which has a risk as well. And some of those aren't ice-reinforced hulls. Some of those do not have icebreaker escorts with them, so they're taking a higher risk position to do that. And we do know that the Russians have militarized their northern coast, and it's really created an environment of paranoia and distrust.
Thank you, and I yield back.
Mr. Garamendi, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to go to the polar Arctic and discuss the icebreaker situation in the Arctic. I'm not going to beat around the bush. We've been at this for a decade in this committee, and we're not even close to getting a heavy icebreaker. And now it's 2028, according to your earlier testimony. My understanding is that the contract with Bollinger is about to tank, that is, fall apart. That Bollinger is not able to meet the contract obligations to build the first heavy polar security cutter. Is that true?
Different words than you perhaps would use, Congressman, but they have been doing a baseline review, and they have told us they do not think they can meet the terms of the existing contract.
Okay, let's be blunt about this. They're not going to be able to continue under the current contract terms. Is that correct?
That's what they have told us.
Okay. So what are our options? Terminate the contract and start over with a new bidder?
That is-
Option one?
That is one.
Option two?
Option two would be to
Force them into bankruptcy because they cannot complete the current contract? That's option two?
that's a possibility, yes.
Okay. Option three?
The option three which is what we are evaluating now. We understand what they think and validate the new costs and timelines are, and then we find the money in order to staff that and get Polar Security Cutter 1 built.
So we're going to rewrite, option three is rewrite the contract and go forward with Bollinger. Correct?
Yes.
Okay. For the committee, we've been at this a long, long time. The current strategy by the Coast Guard, the U.S. military, and America is to have 3 heavy icebreakers available for the Arctic and Antarctic, and 3 to 5 medium icebreakers. That was the strategy. Is that still the current strategy?
We've updated our fleet mix, sir, that we now think we need 8 to 9 in a mix of heavies and mediums.
So 3 heavies and the rest medium?
We're thinking it could be 3 to 5 heavies and 3 to 5 mediums.
This committee has wrestled with this issue for a long time, and we've stumbled. Coast Guard has stumbled. It is time for us to get real. All of the testimony you've given, this committee has heard, and I'm sure Alaska's interested in this, is that we are out of luck and out of time. We do not have the capability of projecting the American presence in the Arctic. Period. We don't. I want to put this on the table for the membership here and for the rest of us, and that's the time for us to get real. The U.S. Navy can spend an extra $1 billion or so on each and every one of their ships, $3 to $5 billion if they want to build an aircraft carrier. The F-35 guaranteed overruns several hundred million for each and every plane, or for each and every tranche of planes. It's time for the Coast Guard. I would propose that the Coast Guard take advantage of the current troubles that Bollinger is having and put together a 3 polar security cutter program. The first one will probably be somewhere north of $1.25 billion to $1.5 billion. And then the follow-up 2. Go for 3 polar security cutters at once. Take advantage of the shipyard of the first one, which is going to be far more expensive than anticipated, and then the follow-up on the remaining 2, and that we put that forward. We cannot lose another year. We've lost a decade already. This has been discussed and discussed ad nauseum. Now, we've got to have the courage to move this thing forward. We cannot delay any further. How many heavy polar ice cutters does China have? 2. Why? Because they know the Arctic's important for them. How many do we have? We do not have one that's available because it's in the Antarctic or in repair. So are we ready to do this? And I would appreciate the Coast Guard coming forward with a specific plan to develop a strategy to build 3 polar security cutters. Take the current problem with Bollinger as an opportunity, not as a problem, but as an opportunity. Let them build the first one. Hold them to very tight timeframes, very tight accounting, very tight review of their costs. And then follow up with the remaining two, taking advantage of a block buy. What do you think, Admiral?
I like your boldness, Congressman, and I'll take that back to the Commandant and our acquisition folks.
And you'll come back to us when with a proposal?
At
We
early
come
in the
back-
new year.
We're back here January 8th.
Okay?
Why don't you deliver a Christmas present to the Coast Guard and to America? A solid plan to build the necessary icebreakers for America's presence in the Arctic. Can you do that?
We can.
January 8th.
Aye, sir.
I'll be here. Thank you. Yield back.
Mr. Andrew, you recognize for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I would like to associate myself with the remarks made by Mr. Garamundi. I agree. I know, once in a while we do agree, and this is definitely one of those cases. And I'd like to thank you for being here, Vice Admiral. We appreciate it. You know, China now has the world's largest Coast Guard, the world's largest Coast Guard. So I'm here today with serious concerns about the growing maritime influence of the Communist Chinese Party. China has made no secret of this, and no secret of its desire to dominate the world's oceans. Today, China owns or operates ports at nearly 100 locations around the globe in over 50 different countries. Many of these ports are located near strategically important maritime bottlenecks. The companies which own these ports, surprise, surprise, are ultimately controlled by the Chinese Communist government. Chinese development of its ports around the world continue forward in an aggressive way. They're not kidding around, they're serious. The situation presents serious national security and economic concerns for our great United States of America. The most obvious security concern is that China could convert its ports into naval military bases. This would instantly give China a global military reach. According to the Council of Foreign Relations, out of 102 known Chinese port projects, 70 of them have the physical potential for naval use. Of great concern to the Coast Guard should be the possibility that Chinese ports may be used to facilitate international black market operations. Activities like drug trafficking, human trafficking, weapons trafficking. Of immediate economic concern is China using their port infrastructure to steal valuable commercial data from our American businesses. In August, the United States Department of Transportation issued an advisory against the Chinese logistics software known as Logink. I'm sure you're familiar with it. Logink is owned and controlled, surprise, by the Chinese Communist Party. It allows them to collect vast amounts of information on port activity, and it gives them a complete global picture of maritime activities. This software gives China incredible power. Logink provides the Chinese Communist Party with leverage to control international markets, steal proprietary data, and dominate the maritime supply chain. Serious stuff. Multiple federal agencies have sounded the alarm on this threat. This affects our entire maritime supply chain. We cannot allow Logink to penetrate our domestic ports, and we cannot allow it to become an entrenched global standard. We must be sure that American commercial activities at home or abroad are not being compromised by the Logink platform. Vice Admiral, as the Deputy Commandant for Operations, you've overseen the International Port Security Program. I'm going to ask you a few questions, and my first question here as quick as I can. Are we as secure as we can possibly be? Are we 100% buttoned up? Question number one. Second question, are we controlling illegal fishing, illegal drug trafficking, and illegal human trafficking? Are we 100% buttoned up? Under the International Port Security Program, our Chinese-owned ports, are they cooperating And are they meeting the expected standards on activities like I just mentioned, illegal fishing, drug trafficking, human trafficking, you name it? I'll ask that first.
So going through your questions one by one, sir, if that works, are we as secure as we can be? The answer to that is no. There are certainly more things that we can and should be doing, especially since our ports and international ports are predominantly private sector run. So the Coast Guard plus CISA and other agencies have a role in that, and we work very hard domestically to try to stitch up those vulnerabilities. Likewise, on question number 2, in terms of illicit activity, drug smuggling, IUUF, we make humble investments for big impact, but we can do more with more. So the answer to that question, are we buttoned up, is no as well. And then in terms of China and operating ports internationally, we do have an international port security program sanctioned by the International Maritime Organization where we visit and validate their procedures against security measures that are accepted around the world. That gives us great insight into how ports are operating in and around the world. Is there more that can and should be done? Given the vulnerabilities you articulated in terms of the Chinese reach, yes.
Mr. Chairman, I know I've run out of time, so I'm going to ask that my other questions are entered into the record. And Vice Admiral, I would like to thank you. This is not a reflection upon you, but it's a reflection upon the state of affairs as they are right now, and we need to do better. I yield back.
Mr. Rockengoss, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. To start with, I want to associate myself with the comments from the gentleman from California about the ice cutters. I'll co-sign both his comments and his sense of urgency. And I also want to add my own appreciation for those Coast Guardsmen and women who were so brave this morning and to share their harrowing experiences to help improve conditions for all members. Vice Admiral, the Coast Guard is uniquely positioned to counter Chinese encroachment against allies in the South China Sea and is a key component of the White House's Indo-Pacific strategy. I'm a member of the Select Committee on China, and I support the administration's efforts to expand cooperation and deepen ties with our partners in the Indo-Pacific, particularly in the South China Sea, which I think is being overlooked a little bit with our focus on Taiwan, but the militarization of the South China Sea, despite the 2016 court ruling against China, and despite really multilateral opposition to it, is a huge surface area for inadvertent or intentional escalation that could lead to conflict. Last weekend, and this was covered in the New York Times in a compelling article that I'm sure you read, the Chinese Coast Guard blasted water cannons to block 3 Filipino fisheries vessels from entering the Scarborough Shoal. They were accompanied by other vessels using a long-range acoustic device, which caused severe discomfort and incapacitation to some Filipino crew. This was documented by U.S. journalists. In October, the Philippines reported Chinese vessels intentionally colliding with its vessels on a resupply mission in the South China Sea. What does the Coast Guard need to help our allies defend against what you termed in your testimony the growing Chinese gray zone threat in the Indo-Pacific?
Congressman, your U.S. Coast Guard does have presence and reach in the South China Sea. We can do more with more, but I can give you a couple of examples. The Coast Guard leads a multi-nation engagement program called the Southeast Asia Maritime Law Enforcement Initiative, which gives us connectivity to most Southeast Asian nation states which are really hungry for additional law enforcement capacity and capability. We're helping countries in that region with our bilateral relationships to establish multilateral relationships and meaningful operations. Just a few months ago, a Coast Guard cutter off of the Philippines did a joint exercise with the Philippine Coast Guard and the Japan Coast Guard, which is a pretty historic moment. We do a lot of training and capacity building there as well, that we are to help countries like the Philippines combat the very thing that you're describing that was just, that just shocked us all when we saw that on the news.
And let's imagine a scenario where the Coast Guard had all the funding, all the money it needed, what would become then the rate limiting factor for an expanded Indo-Pacific presence? Would it be workforce and personnel? Would it be ports? Would it be the ships themselves? Would it be interest from potential allied partners? Like what, all the money in the world, what becomes the next rate limiting factor?
Congressman, I think you've just named a number of
Put them in priority order for me.
all of the above that could. So, for example, starting with our objective for moving from episodic presence to more persistent presence. We can do that when we get more offshore patrol cutters that we can bring into the Bering so we can free our national security cutters to be more present in that region.
So ships would be the next rate limiting factor.
Ships is one. We've asked for 4 fast response cutters in the 24 budget to help us get there. More training and capacity building teams, more Coast Guard liaison officers in the region, perhaps more aircraft. So I think more of those capabilities enable us to connect with our partners and allies in ways they appreciate.
Final question, and you mentioned this earlier about reauthorizing the drone program that you have to protect your ports. Talk a little bit more in these last 40 seconds about what the Coast Guard is doing to lean into autonomous drone swarms to surveil, sense, strike, because that is clearly going to be a key capacity in such a huge area as the South China Sea.
We're just in the very early stages of
Are
implementing.
you working with the Navy and the DoD on
Absolutely.
this stuff?
Fourth Fleet is making great gains in that place, and we are tied at the hip with them on that.
Do you have the commercial access that you need to AI and hardware talent?
We do, but we are learning. This is a new journey for us. We're piggybacking a lot on what the intelligence community is doing in terms of AI, in terms of object detection, so that our sensors can actually find things without a human eye, making gains there as well.
Okay, to be continued. I'll yield back, Chair.
Mr. Easel, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And the only thing about being a freshman is all the good questions have been asked by the time it gets to be my turn. But, you know, I thank you, Vice Admiral, and your staff. The Coast Guard has been just very responsive every time I've called and asked, and during my law enforcement career dealing with the Coast Guard. Listening to what all has been asked and said today, I'm very concerned about going forward and the protection that is offered by the Coast Guard, not only to the homeland, but around the world. Listening to what was said about Bollinger Marine, I understand that Bollinger just recently got to the point where they bought the other shipyard out that was building the Coast Guard cutter. Is that correct?
That's correct. They're building our polar security cutter.
So what they did was they picked up on another company, and they were trying to repair the mistakes that had been made, or is that, could you tell me a little bit about the transition from the former company now to Bollinger and where that's at?
Sure. The former company, VT Halter, decided that it wanted to sell that shipyard. The combined U.S. Navy, U.S. Coast Guard Joint Program Office did an evaluation of Bollinger to ensure that what we thought they had the capability in order to continue that particular project should they buy the shipyard. That was endorsed. They purchased the shipyard. Bollinger has made some substantial movements and advances in this particular project, and I think we're encouraged with the forward momentum.
I've been down there several times and met with workforce at Bollinger and some of their other shipyards, and it seems that they have a handle on work. They seem to have a good workforce, and you know, I was listening to everything that's been said today. Is there any opportunity going forward that Bollinger could complete what they have bought into?
Congressman, we do have some challenges ahead. I think Congressman Garamendi and his questions raised some of those challenges that we have. But those challenges aside, I think we feel confident. And I just visited the shipyard with some of our senior acquisition folks in October and saw it firsthand. With where they are in the detailed design, and with their baseline evaluation, we think we're going to get a much clearer idea of cost and schedule from them between now and March, the first 3 months of calendar year 2024. With that, we believe that they are competent to begin construction in calendar year 2024 to get us to a place where we could see the first polar security cutter in 2028, 2029.
Very good. All right, well, Mr. Chairman, I yield back. Thank you. Thank you, Admiral.
Ms. Peltona, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Webster. Good afternoon, Vice Admiral Gautier. I'm encouraged by how many of my colleagues have mentioned Alaska and the need for a polar cutter, an ice cutter. And I too am frustrated by the projected cost overruns and the protracted timeline on the Polar Security Cutter program. And of course, this is of national strategic significance, but it's also a project that is of life and death importance to my constituents in Alaska. It's not hard to imagine a scenario during busier times, lots going on in the Arctic, where multiple situations could occur at once, where there's an icebreaker's presence is needed. And my question is, in the event of multiple crises or multiple events, and we don't have the ability to summon an American icebreaker, what is the Coast Guard's contingency plan?
Congresswoman, we do have agreements through the Arctic Council structure and the Arctic Coast Guard Forum with specific plans in place where we can have mutual assistance. So in a case with the vastness of the Arctic and the challenges with resourcing, it really is an all-in, whoever is first there sort of proposition. A cruise ship just grounded in September off of Greenland. It's the Danish search and rescue region, but it was the first fishing boat that could get out there that helped free up that vessel.
All right. My second question is that the Coast Guard receives significantly smaller amounts of money than its DoD counterparts, in particular in the context of your broad and challenging, the broad missions that you're all involved in. And if the Polar Security Cutter procurement were to go over budget, does the Coast Guard have the ability to fund an acquisition of the polar security cutter's size and complexity without having to make deep cuts elsewhere?
Congresswoman, we're evaluating options because we do believe that this particular contract is going to run over budget and over time for what the original contract was. There's some options in terms of flexing money between the funding that we have with the second polar security cutter in order to really drive in and make sure we get the first polar security cutter. In any event, to get to what we think we need, we're going to need a lot of congressional support.
So you don't have funding elsewhere that you could dive into?
We don't have the ability in our budget to find appropriations in order to plus up that particular contract.
Sure. Okay. Thank you for that. And when you were going over the Coast Guard's Arctic Strategic Outlook implementation plan, it references a need to expand Arctic surface capabilities and associated support infrastructure shoreside. And I'm wondering if you'd be able to provide specifics about the kind of infrastructure you're referring to or the communities that you're interested in working with.
Yes, Congresswoman. We start, I think, first and foremost with our preeminent base in Alaska, and that's Kodiak. And we've been making advances, and we need to make more in terms of providing the piers and the housing to do things like home port to offshore patrol cutters, which will be coming to Kodiak, Alaska, and the housing and ancillary services. We know we need to build out other locations to home port fast response cutters in Sitka and in Seward to help support operations in and around Alaska. We are transitioning our fleet of aircraft in Kodiak to an all H-60 fleet. We mean to eventually decommission our H-65s. And so that is in the plans as well with blade-fold, tail-fold aircraft. We know that we will need to home port a commercially available icebreaker if we have congressional support to provide that. We have committed to the Alaska delegation that that will be in Alaska as well.
Outstanding. Thank you, Vice Admiral. And I want to commend the Coast Guard on all of the real substantive efforts and forward progress on housing and childcare in many of your stations. Thank you.
Ms. Golden, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Vice Admiral Gautier, for taking time to be with us today. This is such an important hearing, obviously, as the testimony and questions here today discuss. Of course, the Coast Guard plays such a critical role in national security, and I want to associate myself with the comments of our ranking member and Representative Auchincloss as well about the critical role that dedicated service members play in supporting the Coast Guard and ensuring that national security, and encourage you to do all that you can to keep our service members safe and undistracted. We're grateful for the brave testimony of the service members who testified in the Senate this morning. Thank you. While we're talking about icebreakers, the Great Lakes would like a word. We know how important economic security also is to national security, and the Great Lakes region contributes billions to our national economy every year. Maintaining safe passages, open passages through the Great Lakes year-round is critical to that end. And in order to maintain commercial navigation throughout the year, Lake Michigan needs more modern icebreakers. Funding for new icebreakers was included in the FY23 appropriations. Has the Coast Guard made any progress in procuring, late in the day, a new heavy-duty icebreaker in the year since the bill's passage?
Congresswoman, I'm a Mackinac sailor myself, so I know exactly what you're talking about. And the Coast Guard, the Commandant, has committed to construction of a second medium icebreaker like the Mackinac in order to get after what you're describing. In terms of the funding strategy, we do have money or request in the 2024 budget to get the program office running and start looking at the long lead time materials for this particular asset.
Mm-hmm. At this particular time, do you have any projections on timeline?
It's all dependent really on what out-year funding is going to look like for us as we put together the program. I don't have a great estimate for you right now.
If you wouldn't mind getting those and circling back with us, we'd be grateful. So I want to talk a little bit more broadly about funding. We narrowly avoided a shutdown last month with a temporary stopgap measure, of course, as you know. Like many of us, continue to be concerned about the impacts of further, continuing resolutions in place of appropriations. If Congress fails to pass these essential appropriations, can you talk specifically about national security missions of the Coast Guard and how the disruption in funding would impact the Coast Guard's foreign partnerships?
In terms of a lapse of appropriation scenario, well, a couple of thoughts. We've been there. Unfortunately, the Coast Guard in 2018 and 2019 had a lapse of appropriation. DOD did not at the time. We will continue our Coast Guard frontline missions with our active duty reserve and our accepted civilian individuals on those most critical national security, search and rescue, life-saving, life-sustaining missions that will not be impacted. But it's at the cost of our people because they won't be paid, and that creates considerable anxiety, economic stress that we hope to avoid.
Thank you. I yield back.
Okay, well, that's, don't see anybody else that's ready to speak, so that brings conclusion to the meeting. However, I would like to say that we support the request for additional monies that are in the budget, and so forth. We support that. We also will look into the date that you're saying reauthorization needs to take place for the drones and so forth. We'll check that out and see what comes of it. We hope we can fix that. And so, no further business to come before this hearing. It's adjourned.